The room went dead silent. Not the kind of quiet you get when someone stops talking. This was the silence of men holding their breath, waiting to see blood spill across marble floors. Because when a mob boss throws a drink in Bumpy Johnson's face in front of 20 witnesses, someone was about to die. The only question was who, but Bumpy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even wipe the whiskey dripping down his chin. He just sat there, calm as still water before a storm, and smiled. That's when every man in that room knew they were watching something legendary unfold. To understand what happened that night in 1955, you need to go back 3 weeks earlier, to a smoke-filled back room in Harlem where respect was currency and disrespect was a death sentence. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just any street operator. By 48 years old, he'd already survived Alcatraz, built an empire that stretched from Sugar Hill to the docks, and earned something rarer than money in those streets: genuine fear mixed with respect. The man they called the Godfather of Harlem didn't rule through brutality like others. He ruled through something far more dangerous: intelligence wrapped in unshakable principles. But power always attracts wolves. And the biggest wolf circling Harlem that winter was Vincent the Shark Torino, a mid-level capo from the Genovese family who thought his Italian blood gave him the right to claim what Bumpy had built with his own hands. Torino had been moving heroin through Harlem for months, cutting into Bumpy's numbers racket, bribing his lieutenants, and worse, disrespecting the unwritten codes that kept the peace between black and white organized crime. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning, when Bumpy's most trusted collector, Marcus the Book Williams, turned up beaten half to death in an alley off 125th Street. The message was clear. Torino wasn't just moving product anymore. He was moving to take over. Most men would have responded with bullets. Bumpy Johnson was not most men. Instead, he did something that confused everyone who knew him. He requested a meeting. A sit-down. In neutral territory, the back room of Rouse restaurant in East Harlem, where Italian and black crime families had been settling disputes for decades. Word spread through both communities like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson was going to face the shark on his own turf, with his own rules. But here's what nobody understood yet, including Torino himself. Bumpy hadn't requested that meeting to negotiate. He hadn't even come to fight. He'd come to teach the most expensive lesson of Vincent Torino's very short remaining life. Because Bumpy Johnson had learned something in 10 years inside America's most notorious prison that most street operators never figured out. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a gun or a blade. Sometimes it's patience. The night of the meeting, 20 men gathered in that restaurant back room, 10 of Torino's soldiers, their hands never far from their guns. 8 of Bumpy's most loyal operators, calm as church deacons despite being outnumbered. And 2 neutral witnesses from the old Italian families, there to make sure whatever happened tonight stayed within the bounds of business. Torino arrived like he owned the place, gold rings flashing, expensive suit pressed to perfection, surrounded by muscle that looked like they bench-pressed Cadillacs for fun. He took the head chair without being invited, poured himself wine without asking permission, and started talking before Bumpy even sat down. "Johnson," he said, not even using the respect of Mr. "You're getting old soft. Maybe it's time to step back, let younger men handle the real business in Harlem." The insult hung in the air like smoke. In that world, in front of those witnesses, calling a man soft wasn't just disrespect. It was a declaration of war disguised as conversation. But Bumpy just nodded slowly, like he was considering the wisdom of a schoolteacher. "That's interesting perspective, Vincent. Tell me more about this real business you're handling." And that's when Torino made his first mistake. He started bragging about the corners he'd taken, the collections he'd muscle, the police he'd bought, the fear he'd spread. Each word digging his grave deeper because Bumpy Johnson was listening to every detail with the focused attention of a man building a case. Then Torino made his second mistake. He reached across that table, grabbed the bottle of Bumpy's whiskey that had been poured as a gesture of respect, and took a long, deliberate drink straight from the bottle. Again, the disrespect was intentional, calculated, designed to provoke. Bumpy still didn't react. That's when Torino decided to escalate to the point of no return. He stood up, looked down at Bumpy with all the arrogance of a man who'd never learned the difference between fear and respect, and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his very brief life. "Matter of fact, old man, I think you've forgotten who you're talking to." And then he threw the rest of that whiskey directly in Bumpy Johnson's face. 20 men stopped breathing, because everyone in that room knew what came next. In their world, that level of disrespect had only one answer: blood. Usually lots of it, usually starting immediately. But as that whiskey dripped down his face, as Torino stood there grinning like he'd just won the lottery, as his soldiers tensed for the violence they were certain was about to explode across that room, Bumpy Johnson did the last thing anyone expected. He smiled back. Not a fake smile. Not a threatening smile. A genuine, almost grateful expression, like Torino had just given him an unexpected gift. And then he spoke, his voice so calm it was almost conversational. "Vincent, I want to thank you for that, because now everyone in this room knows exactly who you are." The confusion that followed was almost as thick as the tension, because what kind of man thanks someone for humiliating him in public? What kind of street legend sits still for that level of disrespect? But there was something in Bumpy's eyes that made the smartest men in that room realize they were missing something crucial, something that would only become clear in the coming weeks, when the full genius of Bumpy Johnson's patience would finally be revealed. Because the shark had just taken the bait, and he didn't even know he was already caught. Block 2. The escalation. The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Every man in that room was recalculating everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and what happened when you crossed certain lines. Because Bumpy Johnson had just been publicly humiliated in the worst possible way, and he was sitting there like nothing had happened. Torino's grin widened. This was better than he'd hoped. The legendary Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd supposedly stared down the FBI and walked out of Alcatraz with his head high, had just taken disrespect like a schoolboy, in front of witnesses, in front of soldiers who'd remember this night for the rest of their lives. "Look at that," Torino said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "The great Bumpy Johnson doesn't even have the balls to wipe his own face clean. Maybe those stories about Alcatraz were just fairy tales after all." His soldiers laughed. Not the nervous kind of laughter you hear when men are scared. This was genuine amusement. They were watching a legend crumble in real time, and it felt like Christmas morning. But if they'd been paying closer attention, they would have noticed something odd. Bumpy's men weren't laughing. They weren't even looking angry. They were watching their boss with the kind of focused attention you see in students waiting for a master class to begin, because they knew what Torino was about to learn the hard way. When Bumpy Johnson got quiet, people died. When he got insulted, families disappeared. And when he smiled after being disrespected, that's when even the devil started looking for an exit. Torino was too drunk on his own success to read the room. He walked around that table like he owned it, stopping behind Bumpy's chair, close enough that everyone could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You know what I think, old man? I think you've been living off reputation for too long. I think underneath all those stories, you're just another tired street operator who forgot how this game really works." He leaned down, his mouth inches from Bumpy's ear. "And I think it's time for someone with real vision to take over what you've been mismanaging." That's when Bumpy finally moved. Not violently, not dramatically. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that made every gun in the room shift slightly, and pulled out a white handkerchief. Slowly, methodically, he wiped the whiskey from his face. Then he folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it on the table in front of him. "Vincent," he said, his voice still calm as church on Sunday morning, "before you take over anything, let me ask you something. Do you know why they call you the Shark?" The question caught Torino off guard. He straightened up, confusion flickering across his face. "What kind of stupid question is that?" "Humor me." Torino shrugged, his confidence returning. "Because I smell blood in the water. Because I circle my prey before I strike. Because when I bite, I don't let go until there's nothing left." Bumpy nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering the wisdom of a philosophy professor. "That's interesting. You know what I learned about sharks during my time inside? They're perfect predators in water. Apex killers. Nothing can touch them in their element. He stood up slowly, and for the first time that night, something in his movement made the room tense. Not because he looked threatening, he looked almost scholarly, but there was something in his deliberation that made smart men nervous. But you know what else I learned about sharks, Vincent? Take them out of water, and they suffocate. They die slow, gasping for something they can't find. Torino's laugh was louder this time, but it had an edge to it. What the hell are you talking about, old man? I'm talking about the fact that you've been swimming in my waters for months thinking you're the apex predator. But this isn't the ocean, Vincent. This is Harlem. And in Harlem, there are rules you don't understand. Bumpy walked to the window overlooking the street, his hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. For instance, did you know that every corner you've taken, every collection you've muscled, every cop you think you've bought, they've all been reported back to me? Did you know that your own soldiers have been telling me about your moves for weeks? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Torino's eyes darted to his men looking for signs of betrayal, but their faces revealed nothing. You're bluffing, Torino said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. Bumpy turned back to face him, and for the first time that night, his smile wasn't pleasant. It was the smile of a man holding 4 aces while his opponent was betting everything on a pair of 2s. Am I? Tell me, Vincent, what did you do with the money from last Tuesday's collection on 145th Street? Torino's face went pale. That collection had been off the books. Private. Something only he and his most trusted lieutenant knew about. And what about the little arrangement you made with Detective Morrison? The one where you promised him 20% of everything in exchange for looking the other way when your boys got rough with the numbers runners? Now Torino was sweating despite the cool air. Morrison was dirty, but that deal was supposed to be buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa. Bumpy continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. Or my personal favorite, the letter you wrote to Don Castellano, asking for permission to eliminate me. The one where you called me, and I quote, an aging relic who's forgotten that evolution always wins. The blood drained from Torino's face completely. That letter had been hand-delivered by his most trusted courier to Castellano's private residence. The fact that Bumpy knew about it meant either Castellano had betrayed him, or, see, Vincent, that's the difference between a shark and a chess master. Sharks attack what they see. Chess masters control what their opponents don't see. Bumpy walked back to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. For 3 months you've been making moves thinking you were hunting me. But every move you made, every decision you thought was brilliant, every moment you thought you were gaining ground, you were actually following a path I laid out for you. The room was so quiet you could hear hearts beating. You see, I needed you to commit crimes I could document. I needed you to make enemies I could turn into allies. I needed you to expose your network so I could map it completely. And most importantly, I needed you to disrespect me publicly, in front of witnesses, so that when I destroyed you, no one could say it wasn't justified. Torino's hands were shaking now. You're saying all of this was a setup? Bumpy's smile was gentle, almost fatherly. Vincent, from the moment you stepped foot in Harlem, you've been a dead man. The only question was whether you'd die as a cautionary tale or as a legend. You chose cautionary tale. He reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope thick with papers. Inside this envelope is everything. Every crime you've committed in my territory. Every law you've broken. Every person you've hurt. Every dirty deal you've made. All documented. All verified. All ready to be delivered to the right people at exactly the right time. Torino looked around the room desperately, finally understanding that he wasn't just outnumbered, he was outplayed. You can't. The families won't stand for this kind of trickery. The families? Bumpy's laugh was soft, almost musical. Vincent, who do you think gave me permission to handle this situation however I saw fit? Did you really believe you could operate in Harlem without the old Italians knowing every move you made? The envelope landed on the table with a sound like a judge's gavel. You threw whiskey in my face tonight thinking you were humiliating me, but what you actually did was give me the final piece I needed. Because now every man in this room witnessed you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. Now, when your body turns up in the East River tomorrow morning, it won't be murder. It'll be justice. But as the words settled over the room like a death shroud, as Torino realized he'd been playing checkers against a chess grandmaster, as his soldiers began to understand that their loyalty might have been purchased by the wrong man, Bumpy Johnson made a move that no one saw coming. He picked up the envelope and handed it directly to Vincent Torino. "But I'm not going to kill you, Vincent. That would be too easy, too quick, too merciful." The confusion in Torino's eyes was almost pitiable. "You're going to take that envelope, and you're going to walk out of here tonight. And then you're going to spend every remaining day of your life knowing that I own you completely, that I could destroy you with a phone call, that your life exists only because I allow it to exist." Bumpy leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Because death is final, Vincent, but living with the knowledge that you were completely outmatched by the man you tried to destroy, that's a lesson that lasts forever." The envelope trembled in Torino's hands as the full magnitude of his situation crashed down on him. He'd been played so completely, so thoroughly, that even mercy felt like defeat. But as he stood there, holding the evidence of his own destruction, as Bumpy Johnson's impossible victory settled over the room like morning fog, neither man knew that someone else had been watching tonight. Someone with their own plans. Someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of moment to make their own move. Because in the game of power, there's always a bigger fish. And the biggest fish of all had just realized that Bumpy Johnson was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Vincent Torino walked out of Rouse restaurant that night carrying his own death warrant, but he wasn't the only one who left with new information. 3 blocks away, in the shadows of a construction site, a figure stepped out from behind steel beams and made a phone call that would change everything. "It's done," the voice said into the darkness. "Johnson played it exactly like you said he would. Torino's finished, but he doesn't know it yet." The person on the other end of the line listened without speaking for a full minute before responding. "And the envelope?" "Complete records. Everything Torino's done for 3 months. Financial records, witness statements, even photographs of the beatings. Johnson wasn't bluffing about anything. Perfect, now we move to phase 2. What neither Bumpy Johnson nor Vincent Torino realized was that their entire confrontation had been orchestrated by someone playing a game so sophisticated it made chess look like checkers. Someone who'd been watching both men for months, waiting for exactly this moment when one would destroy the other, leaving a power vacuum that could be filled by the right person with the right plan. That person was Maria Santos, and she was about to become the most dangerous woman in New York. Maria wasn't supposed to exist in their world. Women in 1955 organized crime were decorations, distractions, or victims, never players. But Maria had spent 10 years building something unprecedented, a network of information, loyalty, and influence that operated completely below the radar of every major crime family in the city. She'd started as a cleaning lady in mob social clubs, invisible to the men who discussed million-dollar operations like she was furniture. But Maria had something none of them possessed: the patience to listen for a decade while they revealed every secret, every weakness, every fear that kept them awake at night. Now, at 32 years old, she controlled more actionable intelligence about organized crime in New York than the FBI and the police combined. She knew which politicians were bought, which judges could be turned, which cops would look the other way for the right price. More importantly, she knew something that would terrify every man in the underworld if they understood it: exactly how to turn their own systems against them. The morning after the Rouse confrontation, Maria set her plan in motion. Her first stop was a small cafe in Little Italy, where she sat across from Detective Raymond Morrison, the same dirty cop who'd been taking money from Torino. Morrison arrived nervous, sweating through his shirt despite the cool October air. "You said you had information about the Johnson situation," Morrison said, his eyes darting around the cafe like a trapped animal. Maria slid a manila envelope across the table, thinner than the one Bumpy had given Torino, but infinitely more dangerous. "Inside that envelope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are photographs of you taking money from Vincent Torino, bank records showing deposits that don't match your police salary, and sworn statements from 3 witnesses who can place you at crime scenes you never reported." Morrison's hands shook as he opened the envelope. His face went white as he saw images of himself accepting cash, shaking hands with known criminals, turning away from violence he was supposed to investigate. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want you to arrest Vincent Torino tomorrow night. Charge him with everything Bumpy Johnson documented plus the crimes you've been covering up. Make it public. Make it spectacular. Make it look like the police finally decided to clean house." Morrison stared at her like she'd just asked him to fly to the moon. "Are you insane? If I arrest Torino, his family will kill me. If I don't, you'll destroy my career. Either way, I'm dead." Maria's smile was colder than winter in Alaska. "Raymond, you're thinking too small. When you arrest Torino tomorrow night, you won't just be a dirty cop saving his own skin. You'll be the hero who brought down a dangerous criminal that other cops were afraid to touch. The newspapers will love it. The mayor will love it. Your bosses will love it." She leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "And when the Torino family comes looking for revenge, they'll discover that their target is under FBI protection as a key witness in a federal investigation. An investigation that doesn't actually exist yet, but will become very real very quickly once certain people make certain phone calls." Morrison's confusion was written all over his face. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand, you just need to follow instructions. Arrest Torino. Be the hero. Live long enough to enjoy your promotion." As Morrison stumbled out of the cafe clutching the envelope like a lifeline, Maria made her second call of the day. "It's me," she said when the phone was answered. "Morrison will make the arrest tomorrow night. Are your contacts at the FBI ready?" "They've been ready for weeks," came the reply. "Special Agent Crawford owes you 3 favors after that Brooklyn warehouse tip. He'll make sure Morrison gets federal protection and Torino gets federal charges." "Good. And the newspapers?" "Already written. Johnson's name won't appear anywhere. This will look like a police investigation that's been building for months. No mention of private vendettas or underworld justice." Maria hung up and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. In less than 24 hours, Vincent Torino would be in federal custody, the Genovese family would be in chaos, and Bumpy Johnson would be wondering how a man he'd just destroyed had suddenly become law enforcement's highest priority. But the real genius of Maria's plan wasn't what would happen to Torino, it was what would happen to Bumpy. That afternoon, she made her way to a small barbershop in Harlem, where she knew Bumpy Johnson got his haircut every Wednesday at 3 o'clock. She didn't go inside. Instead, she waited across the street until he emerged, then approached him with the confident stride of someone who belonged in his world. "Mr. Johnson," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Maria Santos. I believe we have something to discuss." Bumpy studied her with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for potential threats. She was well-dressed but not flashy, confident but respectful, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew things she shouldn't know. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Miss Santos." "We haven't. But I was at Rouse last night." Those 6 words changed everything. Bumpy's entire demeanor shifted, his casual post-haircut relaxation replaced by the alert intensity of a man who just realized he might be in danger. "That was a private meeting." "It was. And I have a proposal that could benefit both of us." Maria handed him a business card, plain white stock, elegant black lettering, M. Santos, Information Consulting. "Tomorrow night, Vincent Torino will be arrested by federal agents on charges that will put him away for 20 years. The arrest will be public, dramatic, and completely legitimate. By Friday morning, he'll be yesterday's news." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "And you're telling me this because what happened last night proved you're the kind of man who understands that the most effective victories are the ones that look like justice instead of revenge. And I'm the kind of woman who can make sure your enemies always face justice." She turned to walk away, then stopped. "Oh, and Mr. Johnson? That envelope you gave Torino? He'll never get the chance to use it against you. By tomorrow night, it'll be evidence in a federal case." As Maria disappeared into the crowd, Bumpy Johnson found himself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in decades, he'd encountered someone who seemed to know more about his business than he did, someone who could apparently make federal agents dance to her tune, someone who'd just offered him an alliance that could change the entire balance of power in New York. But as he stood there, studying that plain business card, Bumpy couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone even more dangerous than himself. Someone who'd been playing a game so complex that his victory over Torino had actually been a move in her strategy, not his. The question was, in this new game, was he a player or a piece? By tomorrow night, when federal agents surrounded Vincent Torino outside his favorite restaurant, when flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted questions, when the most arrogant man in New York was dragged away in handcuffs while cameras rolled, everyone would think they were watching the end of a story. But Bumpy Johnson was beginning to suspect they were actually watching the opening move of something much bigger, something that would make his war with Torino look like a playground scuffle. Because in the shadows of organized crime, there was always someone watching, always someone planning, always someone waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that they'd been controlling the game all along. And Maria Santos had been waiting for 10 years. The arrest happened exactly as Maria Santos had promised. Thursday night, 9:47 p.m. Vincent Torino was walking out of Gino's Steakhouse, his usual Thursday dinner spot, when 6 federal agents surrounded him like wolves circling wounded prey. The flashbulbs started popping immediately. Reporters had been tipped off, positioned perfectly to capture every moment of his humiliation. Vincent Torino, you're under arrest for racketeering, extortion, assault, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics, Special Agent Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the street loud enough for every witness to hear clearly. Torino's face went through a spectrum of emotions in seconds: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally, panic. Because as the handcuffs clicked into place, as reporters shouted questions, as cameras captured his downfall for tomorrow's front pages, he realized something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. This was planned. But the real shock came the next morning when he saw the newspaper headlines, because his arrest wasn't being reported as the result of Bumpy Johnson's vendetta or mob justice. It was being presented as the culmination of a months-long federal investigation into organized crime infiltration of Harlem's legitimate businesses. Every crime documented in that envelope Bumpy had given him was now federal evidence. Every witness Bumpy had cultivated was now a federal witness. Every piece of leverage Torino thought he had was now the foundation of a case that would put him away for decades. But here's what made it truly devastating. The newspapers painted him as a small-time thug who'd gotten too ambitious. Not a master criminal brought down by a worthy opponent, but a punk who'd overestimated his own intelligence and underestimated federal law enforcement. The humiliation was complete, public, permanent. 3 days later, Bumpy Johnson sat in his office above the Cotton Club, reading the morning paper with something approaching amazement. Torino's arrest had dominated the headlines for 72 hours straight. The man who'd thrown whiskey in his face was now facing 20 years in federal prison, and somehow Bumpy's name had never appeared in a single article. That's when his secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Johnson, there's a lady here to see you. Says her name is Maria Santos." Bumpy set down the newspaper slowly. He'd been expecting this visit since Wednesday afternoon, but that didn't make him any less curious about what this mysterious woman actually wanted. "Send her in." Maria entered his office like she belonged there. Not arrogant, not nervous, just comfortable in a way that suggested she'd been in plenty of powerful men's offices before. She was carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a smile that managed to be both respectful and confident. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for seeing me. Miss Santos, I have to admit your timing has been remarkable." She sat down without being invited, crossing her legs and placing the briefcase on her lap. "I told you Vincent Torino would be arrested. I told you it would look like justice instead of revenge. I told you the envelope would become federal evidence. You did. What I'm wondering is how a woman I'd never heard of until 3 days ago managed to orchestrate a federal investigation." Maria's laugh was soft, musical. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't orchestrate anything. I simply provided the right information to the right people at the right time. Federal agents have been watching Torino for months. They just needed someone to gift-wrap their case for them." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because Vincent Torino was never your real problem. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Explain. Torino was muscle, ambitious muscle, but still just muscle. The real threat to your organization isn't some hot-headed capo trying to make his bones. It's systematic, it's coordinated, and it's been building for 2 years. She slid the folder across his desk. Inside that folder is everything you need to know about Operation Cleanup. It's a joint task force between the FBI, the NYPD, and the District Attorney's Office. Their goal is to eliminate organized crime in New York entirely within 5 years. Bumpy opened the folder, and his blood went cold. The first page was an organizational chart showing every major crime family in New York. His own organization was prominently featured, with detailed information about his operations, his associates, his financial networks. But what made his hands clench into fists was the notation at the top of his section. Priority Target Alpha. They're not coming for you with bullets, Mr. Johnson. They're coming for you with laws, with taxes, with federal charges that will turn your own people against you. They're going to do to every major operator in New York exactly what they just did to Torino. Maria leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But here's what they don't know. I've been inside their operation for 18 months. I know their targets. I know their timeline. I know their evidence. And I know exactly how to make sure they fail. Bumpy looked up from the folder, his eyes narrowing. What's your angle, Miss Santos? Nobody gives away information this valuable without wanting something in return. You're absolutely right. I want something very specific from you, Mr. Johnson. I want partnership. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Partnership. For 10 years, I've been invisible, gathering information, building networks, establishing connections. But I've reached the limit of what one person can accomplish alone. I need someone with your reputation, your resources, your understanding of how this world really works. She gestured to the folder. What I'm offering you isn't just information about Operation Cleanup. I'm offering you the ability to stay 3 steps ahead of every law enforcement agency in New York, forever. Bumpy studied her carefully. Everything about this woman suggested she was telling the truth, but the scope of what she was claiming seemed almost impossible. And in return? In return, you help me build something that's never existed before. An organization that controls information the way you control territory. That influences law enforcement the way you influence politicians. That operates so far above the traditional game that no one even realizes we're playing. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Think about it, Mr. Johnson. Vincent Torino threw whiskey in your face and thought he was humiliating you. Instead, he handed you the perfect opportunity to demonstrate your power. Now imagine having that kind of leverage over every enemy you'll ever face. As she reached the door, she turned back. Oh, and Mr. Johnson? Page 15 of that folder shows the federal surveillance schedule for your organization. You might want to change your routine starting Monday. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Bumpy alone with a folder that contained either the most valuable intelligence he'd ever received or the most sophisticated trap he'd ever encountered. He turned to page 15. Sure enough, there was a detailed schedule showing when and where federal agents would be watching his movements for the next 6 weeks. If this information was accurate, he could avoid surveillance entirely. If it was false, he'd walk directly into a federal sting operation. But as he sat there, weighing the risks and possibilities, Bumpy Johnson realized something that made him smile despite himself. For the first time in his career, he'd encountered someone who played the game at his level. Someone who understood that real power wasn't about violence or intimidation. It was about information and timing. Someone who might actually be worthy of partnership. The question was whether Maria Santos was offering him the opportunity of a lifetime or setting him up for the most sophisticated betrayal in the history of organized crime. Either way, he was about to find out if the most dangerous woman in New York was his greatest ally or his most formidable enemy. 1 month later, Vincent Torino sat in a federal holding cell, staring at walls that seemed to close in a little more each day. The newspapers had moved on to other stories. His former associates had forgotten his name. Even his own family had stopped taking his calls. But every night when the lights went out and the prison fell silent, He replayed that moment at Rouse restaurant. The whiskey dripping down Bumpy Johnson's face. The smile that should have been rage. The calm voice that should have been screaming for blood. He'd thrown that drink thinking he was claiming victory. Instead, he'd signed his own death warrant with whiskey and arrogance. The federal prosecutors had offered him a deal, 20 years if he cooperated, life if he didn't. Every piece of evidence Bumpy had documented was now part of a case so airtight that even the best lawyers in New York were advising him to take the plea. But the real punishment wasn't the prison time. It was the knowledge that he'd been played so completely, so thoroughly, that his humiliation had become legend on the streets. They called it the Torino lesson now. What happened when you confused fear with respect, when you mistook volume for power, when you thought throwing a drink was the same as throwing down a gauntlet? Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson's partnership with Maria Santos had transformed both of their operations beyond recognition. Within 3 weeks of their alliance, they'd neutralized 2 federal investigations, redirected a grand jury inquiry, and provided information that led to the arrests of 14 corrupt officials who'd been bleeding the city dry. But they weren't just stopping their enemies, they were converting them into assets. Every corrupt cop who got caught now worked for them. Every dirty politician who got exposed now owed them favors. Every federal agent who got fed reliable information now considered them valuable sources rather than targets. Maria's network had grown from information gathering to information warfare, and Bumpy's reputation had evolved from feared crime boss to something even more powerful. An untouchable problem solver who could make anything happen without leaving fingerprints. The beauty of their system wasn't just its effectiveness, it was its invisibility. To outside observers, it looked like law enforcement was finally getting serious about cleaning up New York. Arrests were being made, corruption was being exposed, justice was being served. What they couldn't see was that every move, every investigation, every headline was being orchestrated by 2 people who'd learned to play the system better than anyone who'd created it. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in their operations. It was in how the underworld perceived power itself. The old rules had been simple: respect through fear, control through violence, problems solved with bullets. Torino had played by those rules and destroyed himself within months. The new rules were subtler, but infinitely more effective. Respect through results, control through information, problems solved with patience and precision. When other crime families tried to move against Bumpy now, they didn't find themselves facing gunmen. They found themselves facing tax audits, federal investigations, and newspaper exposés that made their lives impossible without a single shot being fired. Word spread through every family in New York. Bumpy Johnson had become something beyond a crime boss. He'd become a force of nature. Cross him, and you didn't just risk death, you risked complete erasure from the game itself. But the real genius of what he and Maria had built wasn't the power it gave them. It was how it redefined what power looked like. 6 months after that night at Rouse, Bumpy received a letter from an unexpected source. Vincent Torino himself. Written from his federal cell, it contained just 7 words. I finally understand what you taught me. Because that's what separated legends from cautionary tales. Legends taught lessons that echoed through generations. They showed other men what was possible when intelligence replaced impulse, when strategy replaced emotion, when patience became the deadliest weapon of all. The lesson Torino learned too late was the same one Bumpy had mastered in Alcatraz. In the real game of power, the most dangerous move is the one your opponent never sees coming. The most devastating victory is the one that looks like justice. The most effective weapon is the one that makes your enemies destroy themselves. Today, when young operators in New York talk about respect, they don't just talk about Bumpy Johnson's reputation or Maria Santos's network. They talk about that night when a man threw whiskey in the wrong face and learned that some battles are lost the moment you think you're winning them. They call it the whiskey lesson, the night that proved the difference between being feared and being respected, between having power and understanding power, between playing the game and mastering it. Because in the end, Vincent Torino didn't just lose a war with Bumpy Johnson, he lost a war with himself. His arrogance, his impatience, his need to prove his dominance through humiliation, all of it became the weapons that destroyed him. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, had proven something that would echo through the underworld for decades. The most powerful response to disrespect isn't rage. It's patience. The most effective revenge isn't violence. It's victory so complete, your enemy has to live with the knowledge of how thoroughly they were outmatched. And sometimes, when you're playing the game at that level, the greatest mercy you can show your defeated opponent is letting them live long enough to understand just how badly they lost. The whiskey that dripped down Bumpy's face that night didn't wash away his dignity. It baptized him into a new level of power that few men in history have ever achieved. The kind of power where your enemies defeat themselves. The kind of respect that comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you can create. The kind of legend that proves the deadliest weapon in any war isn't the gun in your hand, it's the mind behind the strategy. That's the lesson Vincent Torino learned in a federal prison cell, 20 years too late. And that's why even today, when someone in New York thinks they're tough enough to disrespect a legend, older and wiser voices remind them of the man who threw whiskey in Bumpy Johnson's face. And what happened to him next? Because some lessons are written in whiskey and remembered forever,